The Nexus Prime University existed in defiance of several fundamental laws of physics, which was precisely the sort of thing that happened when you allowed 12 different species to collaborate on architecture while maintaining their individual concepts of up, down, and structurally sound. The result was a floating academic metropolis that resembled what might occur if a crystal chandelier had mated with a soap bubble and decided to take up higher education. It was also, according to every promotional hologram broadcast across the galaxy, the crown jewel of the Gentle Species Accords, that remarkable diplomatic achievement that had convinced most of civilized space that violence was not only unnecessary but fundamentally primitive. The Accords had established a galactic civilization built on the revolutionary principle that conflicts could be resolved through discourse, economic pressure, and really strongly worded committee reports. This worked remarkably well for species whose evolutionary history involved floating between gas clouds, photosynthesizing in peace, or achieving consciousness through collective meditation. It worked less well for species whose ancestors had needed to punch their dinner to death while avoiding becoming something else's lunch. The university's admission of Deathworld species 3 years prior had been hailed as a triumph of progressive thinking. The reality was more complicated, involving extensive insurance negotiations, structural reinforcement of entire academic wings, and the creation of what the administration euphemistically called impact protocols. The Celestine species, who considered themselves the natural leaders of galactic intellectual discourse, had been particularly vocal about the risks. Their arguments were always couched in the language of scientific concern and cultural preservation, but somehow always concluded that primitive species should probably stay on their own planets where they belonged. Felix Nethermar embodied this perspective with a casual arrogance that came from having gossamer wings, a trust fund the size of a small moon, and ancestors who had achieved spaceflight through the power of positive thinking. His family's political influence in the Gentle Species Coalition was matched only by their conviction that the universe was divided into two categories: civilized beings who resolved conflicts through elegant discourse, and primitives who resorted to physical solutions. This morning found Felix holding court in the university's Harmony Gardens, a floating botanical space where plants from a dozen worlds grew in carefully maintained atmospheric bubbles. His entourage arranged themselves in the practice formation of beings who had mastered the art of agreeing with wealthy people. The latest incident reports make for fascinating reading, Felix was saying, his translucent wings catching the artificial sunlight in patterns that conveyed smug satisfaction. 3 minor equipment malfunctions this semester alone, all coincidentally occurring in laboratories where the human student was present. Praxis, whose species communicated through bioluminescent displays, pulsed in patterns that suggested deep concern mixed with expensive education. The statistical correlation is quite striking. One begins to wonder if Deathworld physiology is simply incompatible with delicate academic equipment. My research suggests it's neurological, added Flux, a gaseous being whose thoughts manifested as colored clouds. Primitive neural pathways developed for survival scenarios create inappropriate responses in civilized environments. Morpheus, the group's token shapeshifter, had assumed a form that conveyed scholarly authority. The insurance implications alone should trigger a policy review. How long before their presence endangers other students? Felix's wings shimmered with what his species considered intellectual satisfaction. His recent paper, Cognitive Limitations in Gravity-Dependent Species, a Biomechanical Analysis, had been well received in certain academic circles, specifically those circles that preferred their scientific conclusions to confirm pre-existing biases rather than challenge them. The administration continues to ignore the obvious solution, he concluded. Separate but appropriate educational facilities would serve everyone's interests. Deathworld species could receive instruction suited to their capabilities without disrupting the delicate academic environment that civilized species require. The conversation was interrupted by the sight of the subject under discussion making her way through the gardens with a measured pace that had become familiar to every being on the station. Kira Valdez moved through the floating pathways like someone who expected the universe to try something clever, which, given her background, was probably an accurate assessment. She was built with the robust efficiency that came from growing up on Titan's edge, where the gravity was heavy enough to crush most civilized species, and the environment was actively hostile to anything that wasn't prepared to fight for survival. Her movements carried the controlled power that came from spending formative years in 2.3 standard gravities while dodging the occasional equipment malfunction that might involve molten metal or explosive decompression. Observe the locomotion patterns, Felix murmured to his followers. Note the excessive muscular tension, the constant threat assessment. Classic Deathworld adaptations. What he didn't note, because his education had focused more on social theory than practical observation, was the way Kira's movements demonstrated precise spatial awareness, the efficiency of motion that came from an environment where wasted energy could be fatal, and the kind of situational consciousness that would have impressed military strategists if any of them had been present. She's enrolled in advanced theoretical physics, Praxis Pulsed, their bioluminescent display now showing patterns associated with academic concern. The cognitive demands of quantum mechanics, seen beyond primitive neural architecture. Memorization, Flux's clouds shifted to confident orange. Deathworld species excel at pattern retention. It mimics understanding without requiring genuine comprehension. Morpheus rippled into a shape that suggested scholarly authority. My sources in the administration report that her test scores are actually above average for the course. Exactly my point. Felix's wings adopted the configuration that his species used to indicate having proven a particularly clever argument. Advanced memorization capabilities, but no true understanding of the elegant principles underlying civilized science. The truth, which none of them had bothered to investigate, was that Kira's understanding of quantum mechanics was not only genuine, but informed by practical experience. Growing up on a mining colony where quantum tunneling effects were used for industrial applications tended to provide a more concrete grasp of theoretical physics than most academic environments offered. But this reality didn't align with the comfortable narrative that allowed civilized species to maintain their sense of superiority, so it was ignored in favor of explanations that confirmed what everyone already wanted to believe. Today's Cultural Integration Day presentation should be illuminating, Felix announced. She's scheduled to demonstrate human approaches to zero-point energy manipulation. The Cultural Integration Day had been instituted as a way for different species to share their unique perspectives on scientific challenges. In practice, it had become an opportunity for civilized species to observe primitive approaches to problem-solving with the same anthropological interest they might show for studying the mating rituals of particularly colorful insects. Perfect opportunity for a practical demonstration, Morpheus suggested, their form rippling with anticipation. Indeed, Felix's wings took on the pattern that indicated careful planning was in progress. I've been developing some interesting modifications to the quantum resonance platforms. Purely in the interest of scientific observation, of course. The floating amphitheater where Cultural Integration Day presentations took place was a masterwork of Celestine architecture, all crystalline platforms suspended in perfect harmony by energy fields so delicate that a harsh word could destabilize them. The design reflected the aesthetic sensibilities of beings who had achieved spaceflight without ever needing to worry about structural failure under stress. The audience that morning represented the full spectrum of galactic civilization's gentle species. Ethereals drifted in their characteristic luminous clouds. Harmonics vibrated in frequencies that served as both communication and artistic expression, and crystal singers maintained the musical resonances that kept the entire structure stable. At the center of this delicate arrangement stood Kira Valdez, looking like a siege engine that had wandered into a poetry reading. The quantum resonance platform beneath her feet had been specially reinforced for the presentation, though the modifications were subtle enough that only an engineer would notice the additional structural supports. Today I'll be demonstrating the practical applications of zero-point energy extraction using techniques developed in high-stress industrial environments, she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the amphitheater's acoustic systems. Felix positioned himself at a control station with an excellent view of the proceedings, his modifications to the platform's stability systems ready to deploy. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Create a minor resonance disruption that would destabilize the human's footing, resulting in an embarrassing fall that would demonstrate her fundamental unsuitability for delicate academic work. The safety systems would ensure no actual harm came to her. Civilized species had spent centuries developing non-lethal ways to resolve conflicts. She would tumble gracefully into the energy nets below, providing a visual metaphor for the folly of allowing Deathworld species into refined academic environments. Kira began her demonstration, manipulating the zero-point field generators with movements that were surprisingly precise for someone whose species was supposedly limited to crude physical solutions. The energy patterns she created showed a sophisticated understanding of quantum field dynamics that would have been impressive if anyone in the audience had been prepared to recognize it. Felix waited for the optimal moment, his fingers poised over the resonance controls. The disruption needed to be perfectly timed to look like an equipment malfunction rather than deliberate sabotage. His academic reputation depended on maintaining plausible deniability. The moment arrived as Kira reached the most complex portion of her demonstration. Her attention focused on maintaining the delicate balance of forces required for stable zero-point extraction. Felix triggered his modification, sending a carefully calculated resonance wave through the platform's support structure. The platform destabilized exactly as planned, the quantum field fluctuations creating an invisible instability that should have sent the human tumbling into the safety nets with gratifying inevitability. What happened instead would be discussed in xenobiology seminars for the next several decades, usually under the heading Why Deathworld Evolutionary Adaptations Should Not Be Underestimated by Civilized Species. Kira's nervous system, calibrated by millions of years of evolution on planets where environmental hazards could appear without warning, registered the platform's instability in the microseconds before conscious thought could process the information. Her balance centers, evolved in crushing gravity and hostile environments, calculated the threat parameters and formulated a response with the speed of a chemical reaction. The response was not what any being in the amphitheater was prepared for. Instead of falling gracefully into the safety nets, Kira's body executed a movement that was part combat reflex, part physics demonstration, and entirely terrifying to anyone whose species had evolved in environments where the most dangerous thing you might encounter was a strongly worded disagreement. She pivoted on the destabilizing platform, using the momentum from the collapse to launch herself not downward into the nets, but laterally toward the source of the disruption. Her trajectory carried her across the amphitheater in an arc that violated several principles of civilized behavior and most of the audience's understanding of how conflicts were supposed to be resolved. Felix found himself face-to-face with the practical application of Deathworld evolutionary pressure, moving at considerable velocity. His gossamer wings, evolved for graceful navigation through peaceful gas clouds, were not designed to handle the kinetic energy transfer that occurred when a human trained by 2.3 gravities executed a defensive maneuver. The impact was educational in the worst possible way. Felix's delicate bone structure, optimized for elegance rather than structural integrity, experienced what engineers would later classify as cascading systems failure. His wings crumpled with a sound like breaking crystal. His locomotion centers suffered what the medical reports would diplomatically term catastrophic reorganization, and his nervous system discovered that pain was not, in fact, just a theoretical concept discussed in xenobiology classes. The trajectory that followed was a masterclass in applied physics. Felix flew, not with his species' characteristic graceful gliding, but with the awkward ballistics of an object that had just learned about momentum the hard way. His path took him through 3 separate floating platforms, a holographic display system, and what had been a carefully maintained crystalline sculpture representing the harmony of civilized discourse. The destruction was spectacular enough to trigger the amphitheater's emergency protocols. Safety fields activated, structural supports engaged, and somewhere in the chaos, the university's insurance premiums quietly recalculated themselves into figures that would require scientific notation to express accurately. Felix's flight ended when he impacted the amphitheater's outer containment field with enough force to create stress patterns that would later be studied by materials engineers trying to understand what kind of impact could produce such distinctive failure modes. He slid down the energy barrier, leaving a trail of crystalline fragments and shattered assumptions about the nature of civilized conflict resolution. The silence that followed was profound enough to register on the university's seismic monitors. Every being in the amphitheater sat frozen, trying to process what they had just witnessed. In their experience, disagreements were resolved through committee hearings, economic sanctions, or at worst, really cutting remarks delivered in academic journals. Physical violence was something that happened to other people, usually people who lived on planets where such barbaric behavior was necessary for survival. It was not something that occurred in civilized academic environments, especially not in response to what had been intended as a minor social correction. Kira stood in the center of the destruction, looking around with the expression of someone who was rapidly realizing that her reflexive response to a perceived threat might not have been culturally appropriate for the current environment. "Oh," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the stunned silence. That's really not good." The medical response team's arrival was swift, professional, and completely unprepared for what they found. The lead physician, a being whose species specialized in treating delicate crystalline physiology, immediately began running diagnostics while their assistants tried to determine how many different ways Felix's anatomy had been reorganized. "The primary wing structure has experienced complete lattice collapse," the physician reported, their instruments revealing damage patterns that didn't match any known medical conditions. "The locomotion matrix shows multiple fracture points, and the nervous system has been subjected to kinetic forces that shouldn't be possible in a civilized environment." The investigation that followed was thorough, diplomatic, and ultimately concluded that the incident had resulted from equipment malfunction coinciding with inappropriate defensive response protocols. The university's security systems had recorded everything, including Felix's modifications to the platform controls and the precise sequence of events that followed. Kira's academic record was noted, her previous exemplary behavior documented, and her testimony about the threat response carefully recorded. The xenobiology experts called in to analyze the incident provided detailed explanations about Deathworld evolutionary adaptations, the nature of reflexive defensive systems, and the kind of environmental pressures that produced such responses. The human's reaction was entirely involuntary, the lead xenobiologist explained to the review committee. Deathworld species develop neural pathways that prioritize survival over social consideration. What we witnessed was millions of years of evolution responding to a perceived threat with optimal efficiency. Felix's role in creating the equipment malfunction was handled with the diplomatic delicacy appropriate for someone whose family had funded several of the university's most prestigious research programs. The official report referred to inadvertent system modifications during authorized observation protocols, which was academic language, for the wealthy student was playing with controls he shouldn't have accessed. The long-term consequences extended far beyond official reports and insurance claims. Within hours of the incident, every being on the station understood that the human student had put a Celestine through a containment field using nothing more than reflexive response to a destabilization threat. The story grew in the telling, acquiring details about shattered platforms, structural damage, and medical procedures that sounded more like engineering work than healing. Each retelling emphasized the casual efficiency with which civilized assumptions about conflict resolution had been demolished along with several expensive pieces of university infrastructure. Kira found herself living in a bubble of respectful terror. Students who had previously ignored her now maintained careful distances in corridors. Professors addressed her with the cautious politeness reserved for beings who might accidentally demolish a classroom if surprised by a loud noise. Even the maintenance staff treated her with the kind of deference usually reserved for unstable quantum devices or particularly volatile chemical compounds. The isolation was complete, probably permanent, and entirely based on a single moment when Deathworld reflexes had collided with civilized expectations. 6 months later, the sight of Felix Netherma making his way through the university's corridors had become a familiar reminder of that collision. The mobility assistance device that supported his damaged wing structure was a masterpiece of medical engineering, designed to compensate for the permanent structural failures that Kira's defensive response had inflicted. He moved with careful precision now, each step calculated to minimize stress on his compromised physiology. The graceful gliding that had once characterized his species' movement was gone, replaced by the methodical progress of someone who had learned to navigate the universe with mechanical assistance. The walking support, for that was what it was, despite the advanced engineering and diplomatic terminology, had become his constant companion. Custom-built from materials that matched his natural coloring, it was both functional aid and unwitting monument to the moment when theoretical assumptions about primitive species had encountered practical reality. Kira observed him sometimes, usually from the respectful distance that had become standard protocol for everyone on the station. She had attempted to approach him once, in the weeks following the incident, to offer what her species called an apology and explanation. He had listened with polite attention, thanked her for her cultural consideration, and then spent the remainder of their brief conversation analyzing the biomechanics of a defensive response with the focused intensity of someone conducting scientific research. She had realized, with the uncomfortable insight that came from spending too much time analyzing social situations, that he wasn't angry with her. He was studying her with the same academic fascination he had once reserved for theoretical physics problems. The change in Felix's research focus had been subtle but profound. Where he had once published papers about the cognitive limitations of gravity-dependent species, his recent work examined the evolutionary advantages that emerged from high-stress environments. His latest publication, Adaptive Response Systems in Deathworld Species, a biomechanical analysis, had been cited by xenobiologists across the galaxy. Remarkable creatures, really, he had concluded his most recent presentation, leaning on his walking support, with what had become his characteristic gesture. Their neural architecture represents millions of years of optimization for threat assessment and response in environments where hesitation equals extinction. What civilized species interpret as primitive violence is actually sophisticated survival programming operating at peak efficiency. The audience had listened with the respectful attention accorded to expertise gained through personal experience. Nobody mentioned that Felix's transformation from casual bigot to respected researcher had begun the day he learned about human reflexes in the most direct way possible. The new protocols implemented at Nexus Prime were comprehensive, well-funded, and ultimately beside the point. The real change had been in understanding, the recognition that Deathworld species brought capabilities that couldn't be easily dismissed or contained within civilized expectations. The protocols were less about preventing future incidents than about acknowledging that different evolutionary paths produced different solutions to survival challenges, and that those solutions didn't always translate well to academic environments designed for beings who had never needed to worry about physical threats. Kira had adapted to her new social status with the pragmatic acceptance that humans applied to most situations that couldn't be changed through direct action. She completed her coursework with characteristic efficiency, maintained her academic standing, and prepared for a future that would probably involve working with beings who understood that Deathworld capabilities were assets rather than threats. But in the quiet moments between classes, she found herself considering the broader implications of that day in the amphitheater. The galaxy was full of species that had achieved civilization without ever needing to develop reflexive responses to physical danger. Their societies had evolved along paths that emphasize cooperation, intellectual discourse, and technological solutions to environmental challenges. It was probably a more pleasant way to evolve, she had to admit. But it left them fundamentally unprepared for contact with species that had taken different evolutionary routes, species whose survival had depended on the ability to respond to threats with immediate and overwhelming force. The morning she encountered Felix in the Advanced Theoretical Physics Laboratory, the rebuilt and extensively reinforced laboratory, both of them paused in their movements. The moment stretched between them, filled with shared recognition of how completely their first encounter had redefined both their perspectives. "Valdez," he said, nodding slightly while maintaining his grip on the walking support. "Nethermo," she replied, matching his carefully neutral tone. They worked at their respective stations with professional efficiency, maintaining the protocols that had evolved to manage their new understanding of each other's capabilities. But Kira noticed that Felix no longer observed her with the calculating superiority of someone planning social dominance games. His attention now carried the analytical focus of a researcher studying a fascinating and dangerous phenomenon that he had learned to respect through direct experience. When she left the laboratory that day, Kira reflected on the strange trajectory that had brought them to this point. Felix had set out to demonstrate her fundamental unsuitability for civilized academic society through a carefully planned humiliation. Instead, he had discovered that his assumptions about Deathworld species were not just incomplete, but dangerously wrong. The walking support that now aided his damaged mobility served as a daily reminder that the universe contained capabilities that couldn't be dismissed through theoretical analysis or social engineering. Every careful step he took was evidence that evolutionary adaptations developed for hostile environments could have profound consequences when introduced to civilized spaces. And perhaps most ironically, his attempt to prove that primitives didn't belong in academic settings had resulted in some of the most innovative xenobiological research the university had produced in decades. His papers on Deathworld adaptations were now required reading in multiple departments. The galaxy, Kira realized, was slowly learning that species from hostile worlds brought more than just crude survival instincts to civilized society. They brought perspectives shaped by environments where failure meant extinction, problem-solving skills honed by constant challenge, and capabilities that emerged from evolutionary pressures that gentle species had never experienced. It wasn't a comfortable lesson for civilizations built on the assumption that violence was primitive and unnecessary. But as Felix could personally attest, it was a lesson that, once learned through direct experience, was impossible to forget. The sound of his walking support tapping against the corridor floor served as a constant reminder throughout the university. Sometimes the most profound education came from discovering that your assumptions about other species were not just wrong, but catastrophically incomplete. And sometimes, the most effective way to learn about Deathworld capabilities was to try tripping a Deathworld girl and discover that her response to threats didn't involve falling gracefully into safety nets. It involved correcting the source of the problem with a brutal efficiency that had kept her ancestors alive on worlds where civilized discourse was a luxury that evolution couldn't afford.